Okay, so what is this? It's a resource for organizations in the global and humanitarian and development sectors ready to rethink compensation policies and practices. So if you are anywhere from the thinking and talking to the actioning phase, this is a tool that was designed for you in mind. And we did it because we identified a need for a resource to help organizations to navigate the process of reimagining their compensation policies and their practices. So not just their policies, but also their practices, because frankly, the topic kept coming up. Why? Well, we know that there is a tremendous amount of change and transformation that's happening in the sectors. And from what I have seen over the last number of years, compensation is one of those first areas where the rubber meets the road. So it's, yes, change is happening in the world around us, and compensation is one of those areas. It's almost like a symptom of that change that we're seeing coming up again and again. And the reason for that is because compensation impacts every single employee, and for every employee, it's a really visible indicator of value. And so this is one of the reasons why it keeps coming up. And so what all that comes down to is that more and more organizations are finding that traditional approaches to compensation are just no longer fit for purpose. In Humentum, for 18 months, over the course of 18 months, Humentum engaged a working group looking at equitable compensation and the fact that they are no longer, that traditional approaches were no longer fit for purpose. And so the group identified 3 trends that are emerging as significant drivers of that change. And you can see here what those 3 trends are. The first is that there is a greater drive for equity. There's more conversation, there's more awareness, and discussions around equity are percolating down and being woven into the fabric of organizations. And yet at the same time, what we discovered was, as we just saw, there is not really a single sector recognized definition for what equitable compensation looks like. So we're all talking about it, but we may be talking past each other sometimes. The second driver is that there were changes in hiring practices. So as traditional headquarters move from location-based spaces to more a functional framework, the needs and the structures and the groupings of staff categories are changing. And so how organizations are recruiting, hiring, and then thus compensating is shifting. And finally, because of all of the changes at a global scale within our sector and outside of our sector, there are changing power dynamics. So there are what employees coming out of in a post-pandemic world, what employees are thinking about in terms of work-life balance, in terms of remuneration, in terms of where and how they want to work is changing, and that impacts compensation. So the goal of the Equitable Compensation Playbook is to help decision makers go through a process that is deliberate, that is thoughtful, and that is intentional to assess how to make the best choice for their organization and for their staff. And we hope that the process includes the principles of fairness and transparency in that process. Now, notice that I didn't say the best choice, period, because there is no single right way to compensate a global workforce fairly and equitably. And that is what makes it such a complex challenge that keeps coming up again and again. So this playbook came together from Humentum and from Project FAIR, and it really, this coming together really was a very, very natural partnership. Humentum had spent 18 months, as I mentioned, bringing INGO compensation practitioners and subject matter experts to do a few things. First, we identified why traditional compensation approaches are no longer fit for purpose. The second thing we did was define what we mean by equitable compensation in the first place, because we realized that hadn't been done yet. We then outlined the main approaches that organizations are currently utilizing, and then we developed a process for reflection and assessment to make those insights more actionable. And then at the same time, Project FAIR had spent the last 7 or 8 years thinking about what fair reward actually means through research and through co-creation, and had put out a number of resources and tools themselves. And so what we realized was that if you put them all together, it actually could create a really meaningful, useful, practical piece of work to help organizations as they navigate this space. And so that is what we have done. So what actually is equitable compensation? Now, It's important to start with terminology. And I think most of our gatherings going forward really should start with terminology for a few reasons. The first is that words hold and convey power. We can't ignore that with the topic of compensation, because it is so strongly associated with people's livelihoods and with their value, their sense of value, that it's personal and it's emotional, as well as practical and technical. And so words hold value, words hold power. And so we need to start there. The second thing is, because this is a technical topic, it's all too easy to miscommunicate. If we are to be inconsistent with our language, or we're unclear about our language, oftentimes we use the same words to mean different things. And so it's important to start by talking about the words that we use. And so what terms do people use, and how does it all fit together? The terms that you use in your organization may look slightly different, but for the purposes of this playbook and for the purposes of today's space, equitable compensation is one essential piece of a fair total reward package. And so how you can see here is, when we talk about compensation, we're really talking about the financial payments given to an employee. And when we talk about reward, it's the full package of their financial and non-financial payments. The definition here, I want to call your attention to some of these definitions. The Humentum Working Group definition of equitable compensation says that it's providing staff with compensation in a way that is comparatively fair, consistently applied, and transparently communicated. And so those three principles were things that we fell back on and leaned back on time and time again as we were doing our work. We used it really as a touchstone. The definition of fair reward comes from Project FAIR. And so Ishbel will explain it a little bit more in a minute, but what it means is providing staff with a full reward package that takes into consideration 5 principles. So ethical reward, equity, transparency, sustainability, and compliance and risk. And then the other key point that I would like to highlight around language is that it's really is the importance of developing a thoughtful philosophy on fairness. So each organization to do that, and to communicate it clearly and to implement it in both policy and in practice, because consistency really can't be overstated. None of these things can be overstated. Individual definitions of fairness are going to vary based on personal experience, based on cultural background. And so it's easy to assume, to misinterpret, and to miscommunicate. And that's why having done the work on what you mean by what you say and making sure that that's transparently communicated is so, so important. All right, Ishbel, I'd like to turn it over to you if you don't mind, and feel free to introduce yourself and Project FAIR to talk about these fair reward principles and standards.
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Kim. It's great to be here today to talk about this really exciting resource that we've developed alongside Humentum, and just great to see so many people in the room today. I'm Ishbel McBoy-Herman. I'm the director of Project FAIR, which is based out of the University of Edinburgh. And Project FAIR has been going on now for, gosh, we've been studying fair pay for at least 15 years, trying to understand, what does this look like within the aid and development sector? How do we create fair pay? What does fair pay even mean? And so when Kim came to us to talk about the resource that was being developed by the working group, we were really excited, because the opportunity to kind of share what we've discovered through our own research and to bring that together with Humentum's own expertise as well. When we initially started this process, we were really keen to identify, the best way to pay people. How do you find that one kind of gold standard for paying people? And what we realized quite quickly was, actually there is no one particular way that that we can do this optimally. So we put together a working group ourselves. This was 25 organizations came together, and we worked very hard over a period of about 6 to 9 months to identify these 5 principles, which we decided would be the most important things to work towards as a sector for deciding what fair pay would be. Now, each of these 5 principles, you can see them there on the slide, they have standards that sit underneath them that help to kind of operationalize them, help to make them real. The idea behind the principles and standards is that they're aspirational. So this is not saying this is what everybody is doing, but we're saying this is what we would all like to be doing. In a perfect world, we want to work towards a situation where we have all of these principles in place within our reward system. And so by kind of coming together as a sector and agreeing to uphold these principles, we can move the sector towards a situation where we have fairer pay overall. Is that okay, Kim?
That's perfect. And I'm going to ask you one more question, because what I'd like to do now is, as part of this playbook, we put together 2 tools to help you all on your journey. And the first tool is Project Fair. So if you want to talk through that as well, Ishbel.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So as I said, in our earlier research, so this is kind of, around 2010, we were looking at how do we actually decide what fair pay looks like. And we thought, we had this hunch that perhaps organizations in similar kind of areas of work or of similar sizes and similar spaces within the kind of global geography, that they might be using similar approaches to pay. What we found through our research was that actually that wasn't what was driving these differences in how people pay their staff. And we identified these 5 key strategic considerations that really underpin the way that organizations were choosing to structure their reward. So you can see those key strategic considerations there on the slide. And these are all specific to your organization, right? So it's not something that somebody else can define for you. It's, as an organization, you need to come together and make decisions about what you want, what you're doing currently, and what you want for your organization for the future. So the first key consideration is around, do you want to use globally mobile employees? Why do you want to use globally mobile employees? In what ways do you want to use them? Short term, long term, all of those kinds of questions are really crucial to think about really strategically. So not just because you've always had expat staff or you've always had globally mobile staff, but why? Why do you want to use them? Secondly, thinking about localization. So many organizations now are shifting the power, trying to move to a more localized approach. What is your organization's perspective on that? How feasible is that? It's just a really important thing to be kind of teasing out and explicitly addressing. The third area is really around total reward package. So it's saying it's not just about pay, okay? It's also about the whole package, what everybody is being offered in terms of the financial aspects, the cash components, but also things like development opportunities, the reputation of the organization, the things that draw people into your organization. You need to think holistically about that. The fourth one is thinking about the market from which you're drawing employees. So where are you trying to recruit people? Are you looking for highly technical staff? So being really aware of that, which most of you will be already if you're working in this sector, but just realizing what it is that, where it is that you need to go to get people. And then thinking about the structure, the decision-making structure within your organization. How centralized or decentralized is it? That will impact on how you can roll out change within your organization and how feasible that change might be as well. So really altogether, these kind of 5 key strategic considerations are a starting point for your organization. And we've developed this quiz, which there's a link to it there, which will help you to start to think through this and maybe give you some pointers about where you can go next as you start to think about changing your pay.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So there's one tool to get you started as you think about this process. The second tool is a worksheet and a process and a set of frameworks that the Humentum Compensation Working Group developed over the course of about a year. And really what it is, it's a process to help you build a clear picture of what your current practices are, to assess if it's fit for purpose, and then to identify areas for growth and change. And when you lay out the process like that, it sounds relatively simple, but as most of you know, the actual going through and having the discussions and doing the thinking and the work can be quite complex. So I am actually going to share the tool itself so that we can walk through it, and then we'll open it up to the little panel group, and we'll talk about what it all means. So when you download, and we will share with this link, so when you download the worksheet, the workbook, you will, on the very first tab, you'll see a set of instructions, and there are 4 steps for you to walk through. The first step is to think about categorizing your employees. The second step is to identify your compensation approach. The third is to analyze that approach. And then the fourth is to reimagine what's possible. What would you change and what would you keep? We have a tab here that talks about the terminology, some of which we just walked through in the actual playbook, and there's some other example definitions of employee categories. Now, this may not be exactly what you use in your organization, but if you don't have definitions for your employee categories, this is a good starting place to use or adapt or adopt. The 3 approaches that we have laid out here are what we've identified as kind of current practice. So these are 3 big buckets of ways of working that organizations are currently utilizing. And so I will talk at a very high level, and then I'll ask our subject matter experts in the room to expand upon it in just a moment. But the very first approach is thinking about it from a location-based approach. So in this approach, jobs are valued based on the local market where the employee works. In the second approach, it's location agnostic, meaning organizations may have different salary scales for their different categories of workers. And then in the third approach, it's role-based. So location is irrelevant and the pay is based solely on the job. Now, as you look across the chart here, you'll see that we've laid out here, there are pros and cons to each. There is no right answer. So for each of these approaches, there are pros, there are cons, and then there are also considerations to be thinking about as you go through this. The worksheet is going to be the thing that helps you get to that process of what we talked about. So in the very first step, you're thinking about how do you categorize your employees? And oftentimes this may not be something that you are thinking about or applying all the time consistently. But what are the big buckets of employee categories that you have? And then what is your definition? So your definition may look different than what we've had and created here as a template. And then where are your employees located? In the second step, this is where you're thinking about, okay, for each of these categories, what is our compensation approach and what is our benefits and allowance approach? And that's where you're drawing from those different options. So it might be that in one employee approach, and we'll look at an example in a minute, the compensation approach is different than for a different employee category. And then the third step is to assess, is it working for us? Why are we doing it in the first place? What was the original intent behind us taking on this approach? What's working and what's not working? Where are we no longer fit for purpose? And then the very fourth step is, what do we want to consider changing? So we have an example here, and we're hoping to collect more examples that we'll add as more and more organizations complete the exercise and contribute. And it just starts to give you a sense of how this works. So what this worksheet really does is both a process and an outcome to get to do an assessment and think, okay, this is what we want to change and this is how we are going to change it.